chain of responsibility pattern is a behavioral pattern from the Gang of 4 library of design patterns. Its intent is to avoid coupling the sender of a request to its receiver by giving more than one object a chance to handle the request. It does that by chaining the receiving objects and passing the request along the chain until an object handles it. Let's clarify that with an example. We're building part of an application which validates a document. The first thing that needs to happen is ensure that a document's title is filled out. Up next, we've got a requirement that the document's last modified date must be less than 30 days old. If those check out, the document must be read and approved by the litigation department, after which it can be sent to the manager and approved there. Only after the manager has approved the document, it's considered valid and can be sent to the customer. As you gather from our code example, that's a lot of conditional statements that need to evaluate to true before the document is considered approved and ready to send to a customer. The method that checks the document becomes bloated and hard to manage, and there is no easy way to reuse these checks in other parts of our code. Enter the chain of responsibility pattern. The idea is that we're going to put all these validations and approvals in objects of their own, handlers. So we end up with an interface, say iHandler, which states that there should be a method to handle the incoming request. We could scope this to a document class, as that's what we're using in the example, but using generics makes this more reusable, so that's what I'd suggest. As each handler can pass the request on to the next one, we also need to provide a way to set the next handler. That's the potential successor. For each of our validations, we have an implementation of this interface, a handler. So we've got a document title handler, a document last modified handler, a document approved by litigation handler, and a document approved by management handler. For readability purposes, I only put 2 on screen. What these handlers do is get the document passed into their handle method and can then execute their part of the document validation. If the validation doesn't check out, we don't continue. But if it does, we can continue to the successor. Like that, the document flows through the chain. And of course, we have a client that initiates the request. The client chains the handlers and provides it with a document to validate. Before we continue with mapping this to the pattern structure, there is something I'd like to point out. The example I've used is a real-life example that's in line with today's interpretation of the chain of responsibility pattern. However, were you to look up the original implementation from the Gang of 4 book, you'd notice it's a bit more strict. In that interpretation, a request moves up a chain of handlers, and each handler simply checks whether it can handle that request or not. If it can't, nothing happens to the request except passing it on. And if it can handle it, it's handled and not passed on anymore. Both are, in my opinion, valid implementations. By the way, as a side note, for those of you who've worked with ASP.NET Core, this should feel quite familiar. You're looking at a slide from my Web API Fundamentals course in which I describe how the ASP.NET Core request pipeline works. Essentially, you're chaining pieces of middleware that can handle and or alter a request and potentially pass it on to another piece of middleware. That is a prime example of the chain of responsibility pattern at work. Let's map our example to the pattern structure